As you've seen in the previous projects, web pages should start with a doc-type HTML declaration, followed by an HTML element. Add a doc-type HTML declaration at the top of the document, and an HTML element after that. Give the HTML element a lang attribute with n as its value. Nest a head element within the HTML element. Just after the head element, add a body element. Remember that the title element gives search engines extra information about the page. It also tells browsers what text to display in the title bar when the page is open, and on the tab for the page. Within the head element, nest a title element with the text-colored markers. To tell browsers how to encode characters on your page, set the charset to UTF-8. UTF-8 is a universal character set that includes almost every character from all human languages. Inside the head element, nest a meta element with the attribute charset set to UTF-8. Remember that meta elements are self-closing, and do not need a closing tag. Add another self-closing meta element within the head. Give it a name attribute set to viewport and a content attribute set to width equals device width. Initial scale equals 1.0 so your page looks the same on all devices. Now you're ready to start adding content to the page. Within the body, nest an H1 element with the text CSS color markers. In this project you'll work with an external CSS file to style the page. We've already created a styles.css file for you. But before you can use it, you'll need to link it to the page. Nest a link element within the head. Give it a rel attribute set to stylesheet and an href attribute set to styles.css. Now that your external CSS file is set up, you can start styling the page. As a reminder, here's how to target a paragraph element and align it to the right. Create a new CSS rule that targets the H1 element, and set its text align property to center. Now you'll add some elements that you'll eventually style into color markers. First, within the body, add a div element and set its class attribute to container. Make sure the div element is below the H1 element. Next, within the div, add another div element and give it a class of marker. It's time to add some color to the marker. Remember that one way to add color to an element is to use a color keyword like black, cyan dot or yellow as a reminder. Here's how to target the class FreeCodeCamp. Create a new CSS rule that targets the class marker and set its background color property to red. Note, you will not see any changes after adding the CSS. The background color was applied, but since the marker div element is empty, it doesn't have any height by default. In your marker CSS rule, set the height property to 25px and the width property to 200px. Your marker would look better if it was centered on the page. An easy way to do that is with the margin shorthand property. In the last project, you set the margin area of elements separately with properties like margin top and margin left. The margin shorthand property makes it easy to set multiple margin areas at the same time. To center your marker on the page, set its margin property to auto. This sets margin top, margin right, margin button, and margin left all to auto. Now that you've got one marker centered with color, it's time to add the other markers. In the container division, add 2 more div elements and give them each a class of marker. While you have 3 separate marker div elements, they look like one big rectangle. You should add some space between them to make it easier to see each element. When the shorthand margin property has 2 values, it sets margin top and margin bottom to the first value, and margin left and margin right to the second value. In your marker CSS rule, set the margin property to 10px auto. To give the markers different colors, you will need to add a unique class to each one. Multiple classes can be added to an element by listing them in the class attribute and separating them with a space. For example, the following adds both the animal and dog classes to a div element. Next, remove the background color property and its value from the marker CSS rule. Then, create a new CSS rule that targets the class 1 and set its background color property to red. Add the class 2 to the second marker div and the class 3 to the third marker div. Create a CSS rule that targets the class 2 and set its background color property to green. Also, create a separate CSS rule that targets the class 3 and set its background color to blue. There are 2 main color models, the additive RGB, red, green, blue, model used in electronic devices, and the subtractive CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, black, model used in print. In this project, you'll work with the RGB model. This means that colors begin as black, and change as different levels of red, green, and blue are introduced. An easy way to see this is with the CSS RGB function. Create a new CSS rule that targets the class container and set its background color to black with RGB 0, 0, 0. A function is a piece of code that can take an input and perform a specific action. The CSS RGB function accepts values, or arguments, for red, green, and blue, and produces a color : each red, green, and blue value is a number from 8 to 255. Means that there's 0% of that color, and is black. 255 means that there's 100% of that color. In the onCSS rule, replace the color keyword red with the RGB function. For the RGB function, set the value for red to 255, the value for green to 0, and the value for blue to 0. Notice that the background color for your marker is still red. This is because you set the red value of the RGB function to the max of 255, or 100% red, and set both the green and blue values to 0. Now use the RGB function to set the other colors. In the toCSS rule, use the RGB function to set the background color to the max value for green, and 0 for the other values. And in the freeCSS rule, use the RGB function to set the background color to the max value for blue, and for the other values. While the red and blue markers look the same, the green one is much lighter than it was before. This is because the green color keyword is actually a darker shade, and is about halfway between black and the maximum value for green. In the toCSS rule, set the green value in the RGB function to 127 to lower its intensity. Now add a little more vertical space between your markers and the edge of the container element they're in. In the container CSS rule, use the shorthand padding property to add 10 px of top and bottom padding, and set the left and right padding to 0. This works similarly to the shorthand margin property you used earlier. In the additive RGB color model, primary colors are colors that, when combined, create pure white. But for this to happen, each color needs to be at its highest intensity. Before you combine colors, set your green marker back to pure green. For the RGB function in the toCSS rule, set green back to the max value of 255. Now that you have the primary RGB colors, it's time to combine them. For the RGB function in the container rule, set the red, green, and blue values to the max of 255. Secondary colors are the colors you get when you combine primary colors. You might have noticed some secondary colors in the last step as you changed the red, green, and blue values. To create the first secondary color, yellow, update the RGB function in the onCSS rule to combine pure red and pure green. To create the next secondary color, cyan, update the RGB function in the toCSS rule to combine pure green and pure blue. To create the final secondary color, magenta, update the RGB function in the CSS rule to combine pure blue and pure red. To create the final secondary color, magenta, update the RGB function in the CSS rule to combine pure blue and pure red. Notice that, to create orange, you had to increase the intensity of red and decrease the intensity of the green RGB values. This is because orange is the combination of red and yellow, and falls between the two colors on the color wheel. To create the tertiary color spring green, combine cyan with green. Update the RGB function in the toCSS rule so the green is at the max value, and set blue to 127. And to create the tertiary color violet, combine magenta with blue. Update the RGB function in the CSS rule so that blue is at the max value, and set red to 127. There are three more tertiary colors: chartreuse green, green plus yellow, azure, blue plus cyan, and rose, red plus magenta. To create chartreuse green, update the RGB function in the one rule so that red is at 127, and set green to the max value. For azure, update the RGB function in the two rule so that green is at 127 and blue is at the max value. And for rose, which is sometimes called bright pink, update the RGB function in the three rule so that blue is at 127 and red is at the max value. Now that you've gone through all the primary, secondary, and tertiary colors on a color wheel, it'll be easier to understand other color theory concepts and how they impact design. First, in the rules 1, 2, and 3, adjust the values in the RGB function so that the background color of each element is set to pure black. Remember that the RGB function uses the additive color model, where colors start as black and change as the values of red, green, and blue increase. A color wheel is a circle where similar colors, or hues, are near each other, and different ones are further apart. For example, pure red is between the hues rose and orange. Two colors that are opposite from each other on the color wheel are called complementary colors. If two complementary colors are combined, they produce gray. But when they are placed side by side, these colors produce strong visual contrast and appear brighter. In the RGB function for the one CSS rule, set the red value to the max of 255 to produce pure red. In the RGB function for toCSS rule, set the values for green and blue to the max of 255 to produce cyan. Notice that the red and cyan colors are very bright right next to each other. This contrast can be distracting if it's overused on a website, and can make text hard to read if it's placed on a complementary colored background. It's better practice to choose one color as the dominant color, and use its complementary color as an accent to bring attention to certain content on the page. First, in the H1 rule, use the RGB function to set its background color to cyan. Next, In the 1 rule, use the RGB function to set the background color to black. And in the 2 rule, use the RGB function to set the background color to red. Notice how your eyes are naturally drawn to the red color in the center? When designing a site, you can use this effect to draw attention to important headings, buttons, or links. There are several other important color combinations outside of complementary colors, but you'll learn those a bit later. For now, use the RGB function in the 2 rule to set the background color to black. And in the H1 rule, remove the background color property and value to go back to the default white color. Now it's time to add other details to the markers, starting with the first one. In the first marker div element, change the class 1 to red. Update the 1 class selector to target the new red class. And update the RGB function in the red rule so that the red value is at the max. Next, change the class 2 to green in the second marker div and the class 3 to blue in the third marker div. Update the CSS class selector, 2 so it targets the new green class, and update the 3 selector so it targets the new blue class. A very common way to apply color to an element with CSS is with hexadecimal or hex values. While hex values sound complicated, they're really just another form of RGB values. Hex color values start with a character and take 6 characters from 0 to 9 and AF. The first pair of characters represent red, the second pair represent green, and the third pair represent blue. For example, number 485,328. In the green CSS rule, set the background color property to a hex color code with the values 90 for red, FF for green, and 80 blue.
You may already be familiar with decimal, or base 10 values, which go from 0-9. Hexadecimal, or base 16 values, go from 0-9, then AF with hex colors, 80 is 0% of that color, and FF is 100%. So number 00FF00 translates to 0% red, 100% green, and 0% blue, and is the same as RGB 0, 255, 0. Lower the intensity of green by setting green value of the hex color to 7F. The HSL color model, or hue, saturation, and lightness, is another way to represent colors. Delta the CSS HSL function accepts 3 values, a number from 0 to 360 for hue, a percentage from 0 to 100 for saturation, and a percentage from 0 to 100 for lightness. If you imagine a color wheel, the hue red is at 0 degrees, green is at 120 degrees, and blue is at 240 degrees. Saturation is the intensity of a color from 0%, or gray, to 100% for pure color. Lightness is how bright a color appears, from 0%, or complete black, to 100%, complete white, with 50% being neutral. In the blue CSS rule, use the HSL function to change the background color property to pure blue. Set the hue to 248, the saturation to 100%, and the lightness to 50%.
learned a few ways to set flat colors in CSS, but you can also use a color transition, or gradient, on an element. A gradient is when one color transitions into another. The CSS linear gradient function lets you control the direction of the transition along a line, and which colors are used. One thing to remember is that the linear gradient function actually creates an image element, and is usually paired with a background property which can accept an image as a value. In the red CSS rule, change the background color property to background.
The linear gradient function is very flexible. Here the basic syntax you'll use in this tutorial. Gradient direction is the direction of the line used for the transition. Color 1 and color 2 are color arguments, which are the colors that will be used in the transition itself. These can be any type of color, including color keywords, hex, RGB or HSL. Now you'll apply a red to green gradient along a 90-degree line to the first marker. First, in the red CSS rule, set the background property to gradient and pass it the value 90 degrees as the gradient direction.
You'll use the RGB function for the colors of this gradient. In the linear gradient function, use the RGB function to set the first color argument to pure red. You won't see gradient yet because the linear gradient function needs at least 2 color arguments to work. In the same linear gradient function, use the RGB function to set the second color argument to pure green.
As you can see, the linear gradient function produced a smooth red-green gradient. While the linear gradient function needs a minimum of 2 color arguments to work, it can accept many color arguments. Use the RGB function to add pure blue as the third color argument to the linear gradient function. Color stops allow you to fine-tune where colors are placed along the gradient line. They are a length unit like px or percentages that follow a color in the linear gradient function. For example, in this red-black gradient, the transition from red to black takes place at the 90% point along the gradient line, so red takes up most of the available space. In the linear gradient function, add a 75% color stop after the first red color argument. Do not add color stops to the other colors arguments. Now that you know the basics of how the linear gradient function and color stops work, you can use them to make the markers look more realistic. In the linear gradient function, set gradient direction to 180 degree. Next, set the color stop for red to 0%, the color stop for green to 50%, and the color stop for blue to 100%. Now that the color stops are set, you'll apply different shades of red to each color argument in the linear gradient function. The shades on the top and bottom edges of the marker will be darker, while the one in the middle will be lighter, as if there's a light above it. For the first color argument, which is currently pure red, update the RGB function so the value for red is 122. The value for green is 74, and the value for blue is 14. Now modify the second color argument in the linear gradient function, which is currently pure green. Update the RGB function so the value for red is 245, the value of green is 62 and the value of blue is 113. Finally, modify the third color argument in the linear gradient function, which is currently pure blue. Update the RGB function so the value for red is 162, the value of green is 27 and the value of blue is 27. The red marker is looking much more realistic. Now you'll do the same for the green marker, using a combination of the linear gradient function and hex colors. In the green CSS rule, change the background color property to background. For this marker, you'll use hex color codes for your gradient. Use the linear gradient function and set gradient direction to 180 degree. And for the first color argument, use a hex color code with the values 55 for red, 68 for green, and 0D for blue. For the second color argument, use a hex color code with the values 71 for red, F5 for green, and 3E for blue. That's looking better, but the bottom edge of the green marker needs to be darker to add a little more dimension. In the same linear gradient function, add a hex color code with the values 11 for red, 6C for green, and 31 for blue as the third color argument. Even without the color stops, you might have noticed that the colors for the green marker transition at the same points as the red marker. The first color is at the start, 0%, the second is in the middle, 50%, and the last is at the end, 100%, of the gradient line. The linear gradient function automatically calculates these values for you, and places colors evenly along the gradient line by default. In the red CSS rule, remove the 3 color stops from the linear gradient function to clean up your code a bit. If no gradient direction argument is provided to the linear gradient function, it arranges colors from top to bottom, or along a 180-degree line, by default. Clean up your code a little more by removing the gradient direction argument from both linear gradient functions. Now you'll apply a gradient to the blue marker, this time using the HSL function as color arguments. In the blue CSS rule, change the background color property to background. Use the linear gradient function, and pass in the HSL function with the values 186 for hue, 76% for saturation, and 16% for lightness as the first color argument. As the second color argument, pass in this function with the values 223 for hue, 90% for saturation, and 60% for lightness. And as the third color argument, pass in the HSL function with the values 240 for hue, 56% for saturation, and 42% for lightness. Now that the markers have the correct colors, it's time to build the marker sleeves. Start with the red marker. Inside the red marker div, create a new div and give it a class of sleeve. Create a new CSS rule that targets the class sleeve. Set the width property to 118px, and the height property to 25px. To make the marker look more realistic, give the sleeve a transparent white color. First, set the sleeve element's background color to white. Opacity describes how opaque, or non-transparent, something is. For example, a solid wall is opaque, and no light can pass through. But a drinking glass is much more transparent, and you can see through the glass to the other side. With the CSS opacity property, you can control how opaque or transparent an element is. With the value, or 0%, the element will be completely transparent, and at 1.0, or 100%, the element will be completely opaque like it is by default. In the sleeve CSS rule, set the opacity property to 0.5. Another way to set the opacity for an element is with the alpha channel. Similar to the opacity property, the alpha channel controls how transparent or opaque a color is. You've already set sleeve's opacity with a named color and the opacity property, but you can add an alpha channel to the other CSS color properties inside the sleeve rule. Remove the opacity property and value. You're already familiar with using the RGB function to set colors. To add an alpha channel to an RGB color, use the RGBA function instead. The RGBA function works just like the RGB function, but takes one more number from 0 to 1.0 for the alpha channel, RGBA red value, green value, blue value, alpha value. In the sleeve rule, use the RGBA function to set the background color property to pure white with 50% opacity. Your sleeve is looking good, but it would look even better if it was positioned more toward the right side of the marker. One way to do that is to add another element before the sleeve to push it to the right. Add a new dev with the class cap before the sleeve div element. Create a new CSS rule to target the class cap. In the new rule, set the width property to 60px, and the height to 25px. It looks like your sleeve disappeared, but don't worry, it's still there. What happened is that your new cap div is taking up the entire width of the marker, and is pushing the sleeve down to the next line. This is because the default display property for div elements is block. So when two block elements are next to each other, they stack like actual blocks. For example, your marker elements are all stacked on top of each other. To position two div elements on the same line, set their display properties to inline block. Create a new rule to target both the cap and sleeve classes, and set display to inline block. In the last project, you learned a little bit about borders and the border color property. All HTML elements have borders, though they're usually set to none by default. With CSS, you can control all aspects of an element's border, and set the border on all sides, or just one side at a time. For a border to be visible, you need to set its width and style. In the sleeve CSS rule, add the border left width property with the value 10px. Borders have several styles to choose from. You can make your border a solid line, but you can also use a dashed or dotted line if you prefer. Solid border lines are probably the most common. In the sleeve CSS rule, add the border left style property with the value solid. Your border should be visible now. If no color is set, black is used by default, but to make your code more readable, it's better to set the border color explicitly. In the sleeve CSS rule, add the border left color property with the value black. The border left shorthand property lets you to set the left border's width, style, and color at the same time. In the sleeve CSS rule, replace the border left width, border left style and border left color properties with the border left shorthand property. The values for the width, style, and color of the left border should be the same. Your marker is looking good. But to make it look even more realistic, you can change the border style to double solid borders. For the border left shorthand property, change the border style value from solid to double. The black color of your border looks pretty harsh against the more transparent sleeve. You can use an alpha channel to lower the opacity of the black border. For the border left shorthand property, use the RGBA function to set the color value to pure black with 75% opacity. Awesome, your red marker is looking good. Now all you need to do is add the caps and sleeves to your other markers. Add a cap and sleeve to both the green and blue markers. You can just copy the div elements from the red marker and paste them into the other two markers. The last thing you'll do is add a slight shadow to each marker to make them look even more realistic. The box shadow property lets you apply one or more shadows around an element. Here is basic syntax: box shadow, offset X, offset Y color. Start by adding a simple shadow to the red marker. In the red CSS rule, add the box shadow property with the values 5px for offset X, 5px for offset Y, and red for color. As you can see, You added a simple red shadow around your marker that's 5 pixels to the right, and 5 pixels down. But what if you wanted to position your shadow on the opposite side? You can do that by using negative values for offset X and offset Y. Update the values for the box shadow property, and set offset to -5px, and offset Y to -5px. Notice that the edges of the shadow are sharp. This is because there is an optional blur radius value for the box shadow property, box shadow, offset X offset Y blur radius color. If a blur radius value isn't included, it defaults to 8 and produces sharp edges. The higher the value of blur radius, the greater the blurring effect is. In the green CSS rule, add the box shadow property with the values 5px for offset X, 5px for offset Y, 5px for blur radius, and green for color. But what if you wanted to expand the shadow out further? You can do that with the optional spread radius value, like blur radius. Spread radius defaults to 0 if it isn't included. Practice by adding a 5-pixel shadow directly around the blue marker. In the blue CSS rule, add the box shadow property with the values for offset X, 8 for offset Y, 8 for blur radius, 5px for spread radius, and blue for color. Now that you're familiar with the box shadow property, you can finalize the shadows, starting with the one for the red marker. In the red CSS rule, update the values for the box shadow property so offset X is 0. Offset Y is 8. Blur radius is 20px. Spread radius is 0, and color is red. Next, update the color value of the red marker's box shadow property. Replace the named color with the RGB function. Use the values 83 for red, 14 for green, 14 for blue, and 8.8 for the alpha channel. The shadows for your green and blue markers will have the same position, blur, and spread. The only difference will be the colors. In the green and blue CSS rules, update the values for the box shadow property so offset X is, offset Y is, blur radius is 20px, and spread radius is. Leave the colors as green and blue for now. For the green marker's box shadow property, replace the named color with a hex color code. Use the values 3B for red, 7E for green, 20 for blue, and CC for the alpha channel. Finally, for the blue marker's box shadow property, replace the named color with the HSL function. Use the values 223 for hue, 59% for saturation, 31% for lightness, and 8.8 for the alpha channel. And with that, your set of colored markers is complete. Well done!